welcome to a very special episode 69 of It's Never Sunny in Seattle, Seattle Mariners podcast. It is a snow day here in the Pacific Northwest, and Mikey and I are snowed in. It is December 23rd, so we're a little bit before Christmas. Going to record one last podcast this year. I'm your host, as always, Evan James. Been gone for a couple weeks, been sick, but good to be back, joined by my co-host, Michael Ahedo, as always. Durs is out sick this week himself, so, we're trading places, but get well, Durs. Good to have you back in the new year. But we got a couple of things to talk about today. I think obviously the big news that has shaken Mariner world is that the Mariners have made a big signing. Yes, indeed, Tommy Milone is back with the Mariners on a minor league deal. I know that's the spicy news that everybody's coming to us looking for, but I think let's do the non-Mariner news first. In all seriousness, I'll kick it over to you, Mikey, because something weird happened. Carlos Correa signed a 13-year deal with the Giants, $350 million. Apparently, they didn't like something in his medicals related to an injury he sustained last year, I believe, a knee injury, but something that didn't seem to affect his performance very much. Anyway, last-minute deal cancellation. He then went and signed for a 10-year deal, $300 million with the Mets. And the Mets are awesome. Like, Mikey, I don't know how you feel, but the Mets look like a pretty good team to me in a couple ways.
Dude, I mean, we do a lot of hemming and hawing on the podcast and a lot of complaining about ownership being cheap, but to be a Giants fan and to feel like you have Aaron Judge locked up and then not, and then to actually kind of have Carlos Correa locked up and then to just kind of back out. I mean, I think what's come out is that they don't like something from his medicals stemming from kind of a Kyle Lewis-esque slide, I think, into home plate, I believe, in 2014 in the minor leagues, and he fractured his fibula. Hasn't since done anything to that area of his body, aside from stepping on the bag wrong in 2016, which was kind of a freak thing too. So I mean, it's Boris. It's the one agent. I mean, there's more than one, but especially Boris, like you don't fuck with. You don't back out and try and renegotiate terms based on medicals because he's not going to do that. And I think based on everything I've read and listened to, he pretty much right away, he gave the Giants some time to think about it, but pretty much hopped on the phone with Steve Cohen and was like, "Yo, this is what's happening. Like, you thought you were out, you're not." And this looks so bad, based on what we know, because the Giants can't say, because of HIPAA, actually, for once, um, can't say, what it was in the medicals that they didn't like, but that's what people, have been reporting on, and I tend to think that that's right. So shit, man, like, I was really excited for the Giants to get Correa because I don't quite have a second team, but if there was a team I would root for, it'd probably be the Giants because A, they're in the National League, and B, they're in the Bay Area, and there's hella Filipinos in San Francisco, and like Daly City especially. So holy fuck, dude, this is. I don't know if anything's happened like this. I know that people have been talking about things of similar kind of in nature, but like 20 years ago, reflects really poorly on the Giants front office.
Yeah, and especially because Correa was amazing last year. Like he had a superstar $350 million contract type year. I don't understand. I think nobody really understands why they're concerned about whatever this was, be it the knee, the leg, the back, whatever has been speculated. Um, Seemed to be enough to dissuade them when they liked who he was last year because he played great. And this isn't, you said like a Kyle Lewis type situation, and I totally understand that. And there's definitely like the whole Kyle Lewis was always kind of a strand away from breaking the camel's back, and we saw that to some degree. But Correa has consistently been excellent since he's been in the major leagues, and this was just a really weird thing. Props to Steve Cohen for being unfathomably rich and being able to take advantage of the situation because, like we're not here to cheer billionaires on this podcast. That's definitely not what we do. But it's cool that they have kind of swooped in both this offseason and last offseason and really like built a super team. I think one of the weird parallels with this and the Mariners is that we're kind of going to have a discussion even now about the Ryan Divish podcast and the Mariners kind of having not great relationships with some of their star players and some of the highly paid athletes that have come and gone over the years versus the Mets who have gotten new ownership and completely rebuilt their image within the league. And I think that is a really interesting disparity. Um, Anything else about that before we talk about the Divish stuff, Mikey?
I mean, I've just heard some interesting things about it. One being, I heard Eno, because Eno talks to a lot of players. I don't remember if I was listening to the MLB show that he has or Rates and Barrels, but he essentially said, yeah, it does actually, the ankle does kind of crop up. It doesn't show up on, he hasn't gone on the IL for it. And it's more of a thing that kind of bothers him. So there might be some, credibility to some of this, but it's also like, when you do a physical, you have already, there has already been some examining, of, um, of medicals, of things, just kind of doing diligence before, obviously you get to, that point, because a lot of the time a physical is kind of a formality. The other thing is the Giants didn't fucking tell Brandon Crawford, like they didn't communicate with him during this um process. So just, it's just like, I think of the Giants as one of the, more well-run uh teams in MLB. And I think we're going to talk about kind of Jerry's reputation now, um based on, things that have transpired in the past few seasons, or more. And I feel like that might bite the Giants in the ass now too. So that's probably the rest I have to say on that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that Zaidi in particular has proven that he's good at spending money where he should spend it. And if we have one fundamental criticism of Dipoto, it's that he's been fine when it comes to building prospects and developing a farm system and all that stuff. All that's great, but translating it into a major league team that is repeatedly competitive has been more of a struggle. And I think you've seen the Giants be better at that. Like the whole book on the Giants that we've joked about for years is that they're better at getting performances out of over the hill players, as it were, than anyone else in the league. They've done really well with 30 and up guys when the whole rest of the league is really trying to do this whole, hey, everyone on our team is 24 thing. And that can work out and can not work out. We saw like a George Kirby really work out for the Mariners this year and a Jared Kelenic really not work out. So there's no perfect method, but I do think that the Giants have been really interesting. Tying this to the Mariners and the Divish stuff, I don't know if everybody listened to the podcast. I actually haven't listened to it. I did read the quotes. There's some interesting stuff I read. I think the thing that stuck out to me the most was there's some speculation in it that the Mariners have about $150 million budget. That's not how much they can maximum spend, but that's how much realistically like John Stanton is going to allot them for a given competitive year. That is $20 million more than they're currently projected to spend by Sport Track right now. But that's kind of what we've been saying all along. And it's sort of at odds with what the team has done this year, which has gone out into free agency, taking the posture that they're not going to spend a dime. And Mikey and I were joking before the podcast about we really figured that like a Michael Brantley would have been on the table, like Will Myers. Our standards are not high, people. Like we really thought Will Myers was a legit option for this team, and that seems to have been too rich for their blood right now. That's not very much money. You know what I mean? Like we're talking about how they have $20 million in space. Will Myers did not get $20 million. Michael Brantley did not get $20 million. Conforto did, but it was over 2 years. It's like, Mikey, let me ask you this. So the Divis comments aside for a second, do you think that they actually have that money to spend, or do you think that we're kind of grasping at straws and really that this team is $130 million cap where they're at?
I think Divish is probably pretty well attuned to what's happening, um based on conversations that he has, off the record, and just the really intimacy and like, interaction that he gets to have with Dipoto and members of the front office. Um, I tend to wonder if it is a thing where I think one way to think about it is, you draft a fantasy baseball team. Generally, while you're drafting, it'll say, okay, teams have this much left to spend. But really, they don't. When you see teams have like $46 left, that really means that they have like $5 left, because I think the kind of general rule of thumb, and it depends on how much your total is, but is that you want to keep $40 of fab around for. I fucking don't like fantasy baseball, so I hate that I'm talking about this like this, but there are people that listen that like fantasy, and I do wonder if they want to not be, if these are their constraints, if Dipoto doesn't want to be, doesn't want like Will Myers to be the guy that is, holding this team back. Um so that's one thing. But also Dipoto has said, and I unfortunately believe him when he says, I think the quote is something along the lines of, we're perfectly happy going into the season with what we've got. And he names, I tend to think they get at least one bat, because he says something along the lines of also like, we'd like to get one or two, more bats, and also, specifically names a right-handed corner outfielder and a corner infielder. You can probably tick off both with like Brian Anderson, who can play, has a cannon of an arm and can play third base too. So it's hard for me to know. I mean, he was quoted a couple weeks ago saying, we're spending, we're just doing it in a different way, which is such a Dipoto way of. I truly do just adore the way that he talks about these things, because it's so funny. um, so I don't think that they'll run it up to 150 before the season starts. Um, I also wouldn't bet that they actually have that wiggle room, but I'm
Interesting.
not a betting man.
I think that's fair. And I think there might be certain circumstances, maybe, we'd be talking about in this case, a mid-season deadline trade where they acquired somebody that cost that money that kind of filled in the gap. But I think we're kind of in agreement that this is where they're going to stand for right now. And that's kind of, it's disappointing, I think. The team was really competitive last year, and it felt like they needed a little bit of a push. I think that some of the disagreement that's been going on in the Twitter sphere and just the Mariners verse for the past couple weeks has been understanding that the team improved, but having maybe a disparity of opinions about by how much and how much it cost them to acquire those upgrades. And in particular, I've seen one thing phrased a lot, which is, would people have liked it better if we did these things purely as free agent acquisitions, as we signed Teoscar Hernandez for 4 years. We signed Colton Wong for 2 years or whatever. And the short answer is, yeah, that would have been better, because we expended trade capital to acquire these players. And so they weren't free, even if it feels like they were, because people were already moving past Jesse Winker and Abe Toro. There are holes on the roster created by some of this. I was wondering yesterday who's going to back up third base. And the short answer is Sam Haggerty and Dylan Moore are in line for a lot of playing time, because we don't really have any actual secondary infielders, because we don't even have, I mean, Colton Wong is an adequate second baseman, but really he's more of like a utility guy in an ideal situation. Not different from Adam Frazier, who we started as a full-time second baseman when he was really more of a utility guy last year. So there's still holes to fill in here. The last thing I want to do on the Divish comments, though, before we go into listener questions, which I think should be the bulk of our time here, because we got some excellent questions. Really good to see you guys digging into that today. Excited for some Mariners talk before Christmas. But Divish talked about the Mariners maybe not having the greatest relationships with some of their star players, and in particular, that affecting how agents direct free agents to sign, or in this case, not sign with Seattle. And the conversation I saw on Twitter last night from people was, I don't know if questioning Divish's credibility is the way to phrase it, but wondering, hey, is Divish just talking to players who are unhappy with the organization, and that's not a holistic perspective of what's going on? I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. I do think that the Mariners pissed off, frankly, Kyle Seager and Felix on their way out the door. Whether or not that was justified, in particular Felix's case, because he wasn't really playing good anymore, is a more of a wide question. But the reality is that the Mariners have had several really big names exit the organization kind of acrimoniously, both on the team in terms of the players and in the front office when they let everybody go during the COVID season that September. That took a lot of people by surprise. And there are still kind of reverberations of how sour of a note that left a lot of people on with the org. All of that's real, and we know it's real. So my response to the backlash against Divish and people saying, I'm not going to name anybody or name any tweets specifically, but there were some people who basically said this is nonsense. We know it isn't nonsense. We know that real people were fired. We know that real agents didn't like this, the way that their players were dealt with. Whether or not you agree with those opinions is a separate issue. But Mikey, I wanted to pitch you the question as, some people don't like that. I've talked about this now on 2 podcasts because they are defensive of the team. But my question to you would be, what can they do to improve this? If they wanted to change the narrative about themselves, what is a thing they could do to not look this way?
I think they've already been doing it. One is giving Julio a contract that will potentially last for 2 decades. I think another is, I mean, they talk about clubhouse culture a lot, and they, they got rid of someone like Jesse Winker, who probably like, I feel like I've gone on the record as saying, he's not someone that I necessarily wish to bet on, but I think he's gonna probably be somewhere at least in between his 2022 and his previous 2 years. Um, so I think that's where you start. Um, and I think the reality is you can't do much about people's perception of you in that way. Um, it is really wild to me that the Graveman trade is still something that is even thought about or talked about, because he, his contract was set to expire in 2 months, and he was not the difference between making the playoffs and not making the playoffs. They needed a bat, and they got a bat. They got Abraham Toro, and it just turned out that Toro wasn't all that helpful. Um, so yeah, I think the short answer is, I mean, really like continuing to acquire guys that are good in the clubhouse, like Teoscar Hernandez, um and yeah, just continuing to do what seems like, I think Jerry's right. Like, they are going about it in a different way. There aren't very many uh teams that are extending their players like this. So I think that's how you do it, is you extend your own players, you take care of your own players. Um the Seager and Felix things are tough because he inherited them, really. Um and I think the last part of this is that it's already a hard sell to get hitters, especially, to come to Seattle, because as we talked about in the Discord, it's the hardest park in MLB to hit a double and to hit a triple, which, you know, doubles account for a lot of every player's production, So uh, that's why, it's so tough to hit here. Not so much because of the home runs anymore, but because of doubles and triples.
And all of that is also, and this was talked about kind of after the pod, that the Mariners do the most airline miles, air travel of any team in the sport. And we say that, and I think a lot of our fans are kind of like, yeah, so what? You know what I mean? Like like we don't give it that much credence. And it's also a thing we can't change. I noticed that when we have these conversations and there's kind of like a static element, we tend to not talk about it because we can't fix it, but it's very relevant. And when you think about it, I've been applying for part-time jobs. I don't look for stuff that's 20 miles away because I don't want to drive, right? And some of these players live in the middle of the country, and don't want to fly to Seattle and spend one of logistically speaking, if you don't live here and you play for the Mariners and you want to go home when you have time off, one of your days is spent traveling. And that is a factor. And that was a thing that Robinson Cano and Nelson Cruz both talked about when they played here was like, we love it here and we love being Mariners, but like it sucks that when we want to go home, we spend a day on an airplane because we do that for a job anyway. And the last thing I would say in terms of the Seager and Felix thing is that it bums me out that it ended that way. Like it really does. But I also recognize that that kind of divorce happens in all sports to all teams with their superstars.
Mm,
And I think Jerry could have probably done some stuff better and more personably. Sure. But I also recognize that the way it ended with both of those guys was probably going to be rocky regardless of who was in charge, right? Like I don't know if Zarenzik was still here if things were going to be chummy with Seager just because he signed the contract, right? I think that injury and lack of effectiveness in both of those cases combined with high dollar amounts was just that's the way stuff ends when guys aren't playing up to their contracts anymore and are expensive and are superstars. There's a lot of it's a volatile mix of elements as it
mm.
were. um
Dude, do you know what? So I think you're right. Like a lot of these logistical things add up, but do you know what I think might be the most damning of all? Uh, Washington has, I think, the most regressive, you know, taxing in the U.S.
Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so
That
like
matters to players could more a certain
big
type of
time.
player than others, but yeah, they are aware that we tax more of their money, believe me.
So yeah, I think between yeah, especially as a hitter, between performance, between yeah, being, you know, away from everything. And I think I think what's going to help is this new um scheduling format, you know, should mean less travel for teams like the Mariners, or at least less of a um, you know, they're not going to be an outlier anymore. I still think that there need to be more teams on the West Coast.
Absolutely. And you talked about that on Twitter last week, I think with John and Anders, that we
Hmm.
definitely need more West Coast teams to kind of balance that out.
Yeah.
And have a little more of a proper rivalry because our rivals are the Padres, geographically speaking, but like not actually because that's
Yeah,
kind of far
it's
away
so
anyways.
weird.
Like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's whatever.
I
Um,
five. Let's get Portland back, or even
heck
like
yeah,
Mexico, or like Monterey or Mexico City, or
that'd be sick.
Vancouver. That'd be
Dude,
lit.
Mexico
Yeah,
City would be super tight,
it would be
actually.
so cool.
Yeah, I'm into that. Anyways, that's enough about. I think that's enough about the speculation around the team right now. I do want to point out that a lot of this stuff is kind of soft, is the way I would phrase it. These are not. They're kind of like we're having these discussions because there's not actual news going on. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if the Ryan Divish pod would have been the same if they had done something different. So, um, to those people who are a little bummed with the discussions around the Mariners right now, I think that the tide is going to turn. We're going to start seeing a lot more Julio pretty soon anyway, and like I have missed Julio. Like I legitimately I could feel a difference from seeing him every day to not seeing him every day. Like I miss it. I miss him being in my life. So coming soon. But let's do our segment 2 topic, which is let's look at some of the free agent stuff. Mikey, I love your point, which is that we've been talking about the Mariners not doing any moves. There are only a couple players left in free agency who are above projected to be above 2 wins, which is not a very high number.
It's
But
not.
it's not. And you have Gene Segura, who actually like were it not for his history with the Mariners, would kind of be a decent fit for the hole that they have, but seems like a non-starter. And Eovaldi, who obviously like we're already have too many starting pitchers, so what are we going to do with that? But some of the other names that you have listed here are a little more interesting. Why don't you tell us about some of those guys?
Like the wish list kind of guys.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I have a feeling that I think I've mentioned this a couple times, but I have a feeling that who the Mariners end up acquiring, and I do think they're going to add at least one more bat, that they're going to be really fucking boring names. Like they're going to be names that remind you of, again, like Kristen Orfia, Justin Ruggiano, like the most fucking, you know, the guys that were acquired at the deadline, whatever years, and And every time they're like, yeah, this like, hey, this guy is not the sexiest, but he's a great platoon bat. And every time they were dog shit. Have a feeling that's going to happen again, and I think it's going to look like something in the form of Rob Refschneider from the Red Sox, and I think his name will come up again as we get to the mailbag questions. Um, Donovan Solano is like 35 or 36, but someone who I said last deadline, like this guy kind of rakes, at least against lefties. Um, I think, is someone who can play some first, second, third. Um, and then, I think the Mariners have already been linked to Brian Anderson, who can play, again, who can play third and right field. And then there's McCutcheon, there's Tommy Pham, AJ Pollock, and Trey Mancini all still left. Mancini and Pollock are probably going to get a little bit of dough, especially because, everyone is getting paid. Conforto just got 18 over 2, or I guess 36 over 2, but 18 per. So I feel like Kutch, if you can convince him to come to one of the widest major cities probably in in the US, um, probably good targets. So I think these are fun names. We've already talked about Taylor Rogers and Andrew Chafin. Taylor Rogers just joined his brother in San Francisco, which I'm pretty excited about. Um, so I don't know. It seems like it's someone like Chafin or Zach Britton, who's been pretty bad the last couple seasons. Someone like that. If they are going to add a lefty, but they do have options. I think that's what the Gabe Spire signings are, or type of moves are, or, hedging. So if you don't get the guy that you're after or are being too fucking cheap, then you have Gabe Spire to pitch against lefties. Um, yeah.
And I think we're probably both in agreement. We'd rather they spend, if they are going to spend even an infinitesimal amount of money on somebody not good, we'd rather they do it in the infield than a relief pitcher, at least in my opinion, because they've been pretty good about turning kind of middling, no-name relief pitchers and through their system and, doing whatever analysis and changes that they make and turning them into really quality players. So I have more faith in their ability to do that than their ability to do whatever else they might do with Andrew McCutcheon or I don't know. I like that list of names, but like we're talking about guys who are likely to be very close to replacement level. Um, it's just not meaningful. Is meaning when I say meaningful, I mean like it's within a standard deviation of each other. All these guys, right? Like the best case scenario is that one of them busts out for 1.5 war in part time duty, and we're like, hey, that guy sure had a year. But that's kind of it. I really don't like that you said Justin Ruggiano because every once in a while we pull a name on this pod that I have definitely forgotten and I had not heard that name in such a long time. Really just
Evil, right?
it's
Yeah.
I would have preferred it stayed repressed, frankly. But let's do some listener questions because we got a lot of questions today. We got a lot of good questions. We got some questions that tie into what we've already talked about a little bit, and I wanted to segue those and didn't manage to because it would have required that I am much smarter. But we're going to get into it now. Jenny Sai asked, do you think Matt Brash moves to the rotation full time in 2023? Mikey, we have talked about Matt Brash a lot, and Matt Brash, as far as we know, is adding a cutter this offseason with the intention of him having another pitch to be a weapon in the starting rotation next year. Do you think that he needs that pitch to be successful? And do you think that they're really interested in him if it doesn't look like it's going to cut it out of spring training?
Cut it. I think that so as a reliever, and obviously there are differences in mindsets um, between starters and relievers. Brash walked almost 13% of hitters, which is pretty high. I think the cutter helps because it should give him something he can throw in the zone more. I think there's a couple things. I mean, one, I think a good rule of thumb is to not. I know that again, in settings like fantasy, like these are kind of things that you have to do. As a operating baseball team, or even fan or podcast host, uh, it's probably not a good practice to bet on a brand new pitch um, to turn someone, from an unusable starter into at least a fifth starter. Um, so yeah, we've talked about the sweeper, or really his two variations of breaking balls being tough to command because there's so much variation in how they move, and because they sweep so much. Um, but he also doesn't command um the fastball super well. And I think the last part is that a cutter can really fuck up your fastball. So I think that they will give him reps and that maybe he moves into something of a starter role for an extended ish period of time. I don't think that he's a full time starter in 2023, especially that given that you have options like Flexen, like Marco, and like a lot of rookies that will probably, debut. So I would I would bet against it as a betting man, but I'm not.
I also am not a betting man. I also think no. Jerry's comments specifically on this topic were he'll be a fifth starter if we need him in that role, but we like him where he is. That to me says we want him to be a relief pitcher. He has said he wants to be a starting pitcher and he's doing this new pitch in an attempt to like reclaim that role. What that says to me is the team sees him as a reliever and he has to change their mind, but he does not have that spot. And he competing for it, he's very much in third place, in my opinion, just off the starting gate because they have Marco. His value is in him throwing tons of innings, right? He wasn't good last year, but he accumulated value because he pitched a lot. They may yet need innings from Marco and from Flexen. And the whole thing with Matt Brash, remember, was they were trying to limit how many times he saw the lineup all the way through, right? When he was a starter, the whole issue was he was going to go only 4 innings because once he got through the lineup twice, guys started teeing him off on the third round. You don't have that issue with him as a relief pitcher. But we also don't know if he's alleviated any of that because he's been on shorter stints, right? Like a 4 inning stint would have been 12 hitters. He never saw 12 hitters as a relief pitcher last year. They weren't giving him that kind of length. So we don't really have any indication that short of a new pitch or short of a dynamic change in his repertoire that he should expect to see any different results. Like Mikey said, he still doesn't command the stuff very well. It just works when he can be used as a specialist, kind of like he was. So that's a no from both of us. I think we would like to see it. It'd be really interesting to see him do it again. But much like Edwin Diaz, I think that they've made the decision on him and they're not going back on it, I think is the way to put that. Anything else on that, Mikey?
I don't think so.
All right. Let's go to Azrael's question, which is which bats are legitimately available, not in Dreamland, for the right price? And what would it take for the Mariners to get them? We talked about a little bit of that in terms of the free agents. I'm still sad that we went from no Mitch to no Michael Brantley to no Will Myers to maybe Donovan Solano. It's been a slide, but um, I do think that Brian Reynolds is still on the table, mostly because Divish's comments made it clear that they did try and trade for him with some version of what was proposed at the trade deadline last year. Mikey, let's tie this into we got a question of what would it take for us to trade for Brian Reynolds. Why don't you give your pitch first and I'll go second?
Yeah. So I couldn't even I thought about some names and couldn't quite, you know, uh, d- decide on, latter pieces in the package. I think based on what we heard a couple days ago is it starts with a top prospect in terms of a pitcher. Uh, you could argue that both Bryce Miller and Emerson Hancock are that. You could also easily argue that they're both not that. There's also that the Pirates are not a particularly smart um, team, but I think it starts with one of them. And again, if you're a more progressive team, like you might be interested in someone like Brian Wu or whatever. But um, these aren't guys that are like Bobby Miller or other names that have been thrown around. Uh, Maybe both of them, and then I think Harry Ford and then I think Jared Kelnick. Um, I just, as I think about it, if I'm the Pirates, I'm like, I want some guys, some young guys that can contribute now, and I also want, you know, some top of the line prospects. And it's hard for me to imagine that the Mariners have that, you know. Um maybe maybe because you can trade I don't and I always forget. I think now you can trade your comp B picks, or that's not even a thing anymore, right? It's the pick that they were awarded for Julio winning rookie of the year.
Yeah.
Um that's something that you can offer. That's something that's really valuable. That's something that the Pirates might like. Um but I had trouble coming up with something that the Pirates would be interested in now. I think it might be
Yeah.
Matt Brash.
Yeah.
Um, I think it might be Matt Brash as part of that package too. So something with those names and probably more because the reports are that they're pretty pie in the sky.
Yeah, and my pitch is similar to yours. What the issue the Mariners have, and when you said that the Pirates are not a smart team, what you mean is that there are what I might call diamond in the rough picks on the Mariners minor league system that are not have not achieved the level of like national notoriety and acclaim that they are probably worth. And I'm specifically talking about Miller, um, mostly Miller, Miller, and maybe Harry Ford, in particular. But the thing is that the Pirates might, not being an organization that values that as much, be more interested in names from other teams that are conventionally on a top 100 prospect list, right? Like if I'm if I'm a smart team trading with the Mariners, I'm more interested in Miller and Ford than I am like Hancock and Trammell, but they might not be. That said, my exact proposal here, before I get too off the rails, is pick two of Hancock, Dollar, and Miller. So I think they want two of the Mariners' top three pitching prospects. I think that they want one of Trammell or Kelnick. Outfielder for an outfielder. Somebody's got to play that spot. They are both technically prospects, even if they have some diminished value. And then I think there's a throw in. It's like a Clase, a 110, somebody to kind of fill that out. The alternative is that you do Matt Brash instead of the second pitcher. So you do like a Hancock and a Brash or a Dollard and a Brash, and then no throw in. I think that that is a fair trade from a talent perspective, but much like you, I think the Pirates say no. I think that they can. Another team will probably offer them better conventional baseball America top 100 prospect value than that because those are deep cut prospect picks, even if they have high upside value. What do you think of that, Mikey?
I think the easiest way to think about it is we are now co-GMs of the Pirates, and the Mariners have just offered us Bryce Miller, Matt Brash, Jared Kelnick, and Jonathan Clase. What do you say?
Being biased and liking the Mariners prospects, I think I would say yes to that deal also because I recognize they are dreadful and three of those players might immediately be three of the best players on the Pirates, being Jared and Matt Brash in particular. Like legitimately Matt Brash might be the Pirates' best starting pitcher. Um but I think I think I say no. I think it's a hard sell and I think that if Brash is a relief pitcher and Jared is not good, then the other value is not there for it.
Yeah, and I think I'm just trying to think of like what can get it over the top that the Mariners can actually part with and not suffer because of it.
Or
And
in other
I'm
words, how do you
struggling,
do this without trading Harry Ford is kind of the trick, right? Like,
Oh, I mean that's probably what does it for the Pirates is
yeah.
is someone like Harry Ford.
And that's also probably what breaks it for the Mariners because without Harry Ford, who else plays for the Mariners minor leagues?
Honestly, yeah. Yeah, because yeah, if you really zoom out, you're like, okay, that is Bryce Miller, who could be a reliever. That is Matt Brash, who is probably a reliever. That's Kelnick, who might not even be like an outfielder for, and then Jonathan Clase, who question mark. And then Harry Ford, who's currently not far removed from a high school catcher, or a high school player turned catcher. Um, yeah. So I think when discussing these things, it's important that whatever you come up with makes you sweat a little bit, because if it's not, it's probably not a very good trade proposal. Um, so yeah, I feel like what we came up with is like, yeah, we could probably be sweating a little bit more.
Yeah, and like it's not out of the realm of possibility. Like I feel like this is semi-realistic. It's probably a little more Mariners slanted just because again, we value the prospects highly. I know Miller is really good and think of him as a starting pitching prospect. That's not the book on him in a wider picture nationally. So if you're not making those same evaluations, you're looking at that package going, who are these scrubs? And maybe that's fair. And also, if the Pirates did do this trade and these prospects continue to develop, they might look really smart in a year because Brian Reynolds might post 3 wins and look like he's maybe not all that great in T-Mobile Park. That's a risk as well. So yeah, that's a long way to say if there was a guy we'd really like to have, Reynolds is kind of up there. Um, but I don't. The Mariners are a weird fit for that trade specifically. Our older prospects who the Pirates might like, who anybody might like, haven't been very good. Our younger guys are so far away and not nationally recognized where they aren't really worth trade clout. Complicated answer, but that's the reality. Let's tie this into, we've been talking about Brash starting. We've been talking about trading some of the starting pitching prospects. Ian asked, would you rather give the fifth spot to Marco or Flexen or whatever rookie is left after a good spring training? Are you comfortable with the gamble, the way the Mariners have this set up? They're going to have Marco and Flexen take those innings, right? Realistically, yeah.
I mean, I think it makes sense to let Marco get some bulk and just let himself play out of the number 5 spot. Um, because Marco, at least I'm trying to think of how long it's been. I'll just pull up his page. Um, I mean, he threw 183 innings last season, and it was replacement level if you ask, Fangraphs for. But like 183 replacement level innings is actually pretty valuable in some ways. So I complain about him all the time. But I think that, especially, given, again, like, until Gilbert and Kirby are built up, um, I I think it's probably just worth letting him do that, because it's not like flexing is sexy either. Um, I just feel like he just needs to change his repertoire, like his pitch mix. Because I feel like Marco is still kind of interesting. He just pitches in such a way that is not. um, so yeah, I think that's. I mean, obviously we don't need to focus on this too much, but um, I think you should be comfortable going in with Marco and Flex as your number 5s. I will say I think I'm the low man both on the rotation and the bullpen, because I can see where things go wrong, you know.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's kind of an embarrassment of riches that Marco is our number 5. There are a lot of teams that Marco is not the fifth worst pitcher. That Marco is, a number 3, number 4, and is very essential in them being competitive. It's really only because, again, George Kirby was just here all of a sudden and ready to roll that we are in this situation, and we should be thankful for that. I like our rotation a lot. I like you. I'm a little skeptical of the bullpen round 3. They had 2 good years back to back. I'm curious how they do it without Swanson next year. But they've earned the benefit of the doubt in kind of filling that spot in and seeing how it goes. Let's go to Zach Jabal's question, which is, isn't the free agent class of 2023 a better fit for the Mariners than this one? Mikey and I discussed this a little bit pre-pod, went back and forth. If you take Shohei Otani's name out of that discussion, which I think is the thing that all of us are looking at, and I understand why that is because of the narratives that have gone around and because there's already speculation that the Mariners are going to try and do that. If you remove his name from that discussion, Mikey, just a simple yes or no, do you think it is a better fit overall?
No. Uh, and I know I'm breaking the rules, but they're ranked 18th in payroll this year and 13th next year. And if 150 is the cap, they have 102 million on the books for next year. It's payroll already, and Shohei's going to make a lot of money. So, and then there's also that the Mets are just going to sign whoever they want apparently. So, no.
I also say no. Honestly, without Shohei's name on the free agent list, it doesn't look meaningfully different than anyone who's available this year, and the Mariners really don't want to spend money on anyone who's available this year. So I'm hard pressed to look at that 2024 free agent list and think like, yeah, this is where the team should spend. I've lied to myself about that now 2 years in a row. So I can't do it again. I Hey, if you're optimistic about that, that's good, but I don't think it's that different. And like you said, Shohei's going to get a lot. Shohei might get 50 million a year. Like, we talked about the Mariners having 20 million, 30 million wiggle room. That is definitely too much if they're not going to move some stuff elsewhere. So, yeah, I think no. Um, Sorry. Clay wins. Which teams could be good, willing trade partners for the Mariners? Are there any outfielder, first baseman you think would be good targets to add? Mikey, you had an interesting answer.
I think it's interesting. So, oh, did I? Oh, I did put this down. Okay. I got a couple, and these are just like hastily, whatever. The Guardians don't seem to want Ahmed Rosario. The Mariners fucking love taking non-outfielders and making them outfielders. Um, let's take Ahmed Rosario and throw him in left field. um, I mean, they have the luxury of just taking Andres Jimenez and moving him to short. I don't know who they plug in at second base, but that is an answer. Um, Honestly, I think I can get with Rob Refschneider platooning with Jared Koenig, much in the way of like Chris Denorfia, and Justin Ruggiano acquisitions being what I think we're gonna do. And then the rest of the way, I think you trade from your surplus, which, whatever, and trade a reliever to either the Cubs for if the Cubs are feeling crazy and don't believe in Brennan Davis, maybe, or Patrick Wisdom, to the Giants for Austin Slater, although I think uh I think both Refschneider and Slater are the main kind of righties that both teams are gonna kind of use to platoon. The Giants love fucking platooning. I think what you're probably referring to is a reliever for Keston Hira. And I can actually hear like 47 people listening to this and actively throwing up because of his, what was it, 47% strikeout rate?
Yeah, 47.1% strikeout rate. Half the time.
um, I mean, he's just not a good athlete, but he was just always supposed to hit like his hit tool is a above average 60 grade, you know, hit tool. Um, he does barrel the ball, he does hit the ball hard, and I think that he can kind of put it together. He just chases a lot. He chases a lot and he swings and misses a lot. But um that's kind of the thing. And I don't know when I'll have a chance to say this, so I'm just going to say it now. I'm sure it'll come up. The Mariners were one of the worst teams by batting average last year. And I know that batting average is a really, um kind of rudimentary stat obviously, but it's important in that you have a runner on first and second and you want to get them home. You don't get them home by doing, I don't know what the number would be, but hitting a home run 5% of the time. And you don't get them home by walking, which the Mariners also did a lot. you get them home by getting a base hit, which would score at least one, base runner. The Mariners really struggled with leaving runners on base and not being able to move them over. And I think one way to cure that is guys that hit for high average. And that's part of the reason why, well, I mean, Keston Hiura is like the opposite of that, but that's why I named some of the guys that I name. Um, it's because I think the Mariners really need to be able to do that better if they want to score runs. Maybe they don't.
I agree. I get poo-pooed, I feel like, a lot when I talk about batting average. People are like, "Oh, batting average." But as it relates to the Mariners specifically in T-Mobile Park, the Mariners have a historically low batting average, and T-Mobile Park is the most offensive repressing stadium in the league. So it matters quite a bit whether or not guys can hit their way on base as opposed to just walking. Um, and I understand that, OBP and Moneyball and like those things matter more. They do matter more. But if you watch the Mariners last year, like you said, strand runners, you understand that like somebody who can hit anything out of the infield like had some value last year. And if there's one thing I want to give the Mariners credit for, it's that I do feel like they replaced Adam Frazier and to some degree Mitch Haniger with two guys who I think are better bets to succeed in the offensive environment here. Teoscar Hernandez in particular, like the exit velocities gives me faith that he's going to keep some of those doubles that Adam Frazier definitely lost and that Jesse Winker. Yeah, that's how that went. Yeah, there are options here as far as outfielders, first baseman. I think Cooper Hummel. Sorry,
I keep
that's
forgetting he's a thing. Like even within podcasts, I was looking at his name earlier and just forgot he existed.
he's here. He's definitely
I
here. In his
I don't know.
defense, I kind of like his Fangraphs page. His numbers are mildly intriguing. It just breaks my heart he was traded for Kyle Lewis, so I'm obligated not to like him just yet, but he is mildly interesting on paper. Um Zach Leff wants to know, this is too open ended, but who is the worst player you'd be willing to shell out multiple top farm pieces for? I think we kind of answered that a little bit with Brian Reynolds. We also talked about pre-pod Jeff McNeil, who might be available just because the Mets keep signing in superstar infielders and maybe eventually need a leak somewhere, and he would be a really interesting option. I would love Chris Bryant personally, even though he has the no trade clause, because I think his contract doesn't look as bad as it looked even 6 months ago, and we still need a right-handed bat. So what do you know? But yeah, anyone else there, Mikey?
I think this relates to the batting average thing I was saying, and maybe in saying like the worst player, I'm kind of underrating him. And they would never trade him. But I fucking love Stephen Kwan. To have a guy that just hits like that and fields like he does, perfect. Perfect fit for the Mariners. Like elevates this team so much. Um if you want to get crazy, I feel like Ian Happ. I don't know. I don't know how we're defining, these top guys, but um and he's not a batting average guy. But and just like so inconsistent. It's like the Eric Hosmer thing where every other season he's kind of bad. Um, but I think one of those two, Brendan Donovan.
Not a bad answer. The honest answer I would give to this question is something they already did, which is Colton Wong. Is an upgrade, but like not an upgrade that costs much and is probably not even as good as he's already been, given that he's coming off 2 career seasons and he's 32. Like he's sort of an answer I would give. He's what the team traded
I
for.
feel like, I mean, really, I think the way to think about Zach's question is who would you give up like
Like a
Harry
Miller or a
Ford
Hancock
and
for. Yeah.
yeah. So I think Kwan, right?
You're pitching it as a good prospect. We're trading good prospects for like a really good young player in this
Especially
instance.
in the Mariner system, I think a top 5 prospect. So yeah, what's a Miller, Ford, uh, Young? Yeah, so probably someone a half tier below Stephen Kwan. I just want this team to get better.
Yeah. A quality young middle infielder with a decent batting average would be really nice. Like, it doesn't really matter who it is, but just the archetype would be pretty sweet. But notice we didn't say pitchers because I think you and I both, and Anders as well, and really a lot of us Mariner fans feel really good about the current pitching crop in the major leagues, in the minor leagues, wherever. But I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, but Motri, Mochre, Motri asked about Justice Sheffield. And Mikey, I'm going to kick this over to you because I know that you are just the biggest Justice Sheffield fan of his repertoire. But
LOL.
we talked about this before. What went wrong with Justice?
I will say, and I guess I said it a couple weeks ago, but I did advocate for him as Rookie of the Year in like 2020. So I'm not the least Justice Sheffield fan. Um, I think it's pretty much as simple as so 2019 kind of mixed results, and I think they went into the off season, uh, and towards spring training showed him a sinker grip, and he just, they raved about how natural it felt, how much, movement it was getting, and how much better it was than the four seamer, and that's all true. The four seamer had pretty, bad shape, so it's like I think the article title I wrote, it was actually my first Lookout Landing article, was like Justice Sheffield is leaning into it, and that was essentially like he's leaning into that sinking action by throwing a sinker. And I think that is a better shape for him. I think that he probably needs to throw more four seams at the top of the zone, which might seem weird, but I think he just has nothing to threaten upstairs, or like a cutter. You already have cutting action, dude. Um, but more than anything, he was throwing his slider 84 miles per hour in 2019, and this year was throwing at 81. So I think something happened with the slider, which was really his only good pitch, and the sinker hasn't been a good pitch for him. So I think that's really it. Is the sinker didn't actually make him better. In fact, it in 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 removing some of that kind of space between the main fastball and the slider, it arguably made him worse. Um, but I think the biggest thing is, like, if you throw a slider like his, you probably want to throw it kind of hard, and he doesn't throw it very hard anymore. So if I was a doctor, I would prescribe Justice Sheffield, a pitching doctor. I would prescribe him a couple extra ticks on the slider and a cutter or something.
Yeah, long and short, this stuff isn't very good. He lost some velocity, especially like from his Yankees prospect days. He just doesn't throw that hard anymore. He was throwing 96, 95. He throws more like 92 these days, fastball, 93. Doesn't get that much separation. Doesn't seem to fool anyone. We talked about this when he was starting kind of at the end of 2020. He was getting kind of shelled, and like it sure seems like the hitters see the balls really well. And it doesn't matter off speed or fastball. He was just getting hit. So I think you kind of see we watched him change his repertoire and then him lose it like a little bit of edge on every facet of his statistics. Like he was throwing less hard, he was walking more people, he was getting fewer strikeouts, he was missing less bats, like just everything. And I want to tie this into, we had a question from Brendan Ryan was here, which is, the Mariners develop pitchers really well, which is obviously at odds with the Justice Sheffield situation, but why haven't they been able to develop hitters as well? It's $1 million question, isn't it? The Mariners seem to be pretty ahead of the curve when it comes to developing pitchers. Stuff like gas camp, like George Kirby, really why he has been better than advertised as a prospect is because the Mariners drafted a guy who was throwing 93, 94, went to gas camp, put on a bunch of muscle mass, continued to have the same control he had before, but was suddenly throwing 98 miles an hour. There were reports of him throwing over 100 in the minor leagues. I'm pretty sure that is slightly elevated because of Arizona air or whatever. But like he's thrown 98 miles per hour in the major leagues this past season. There isn't necessarily a version of doing that with hitters to the same degree. Whatever process they've perfected with pitchers. One is that they're very statistically on the front of the curve. They're showing pitchers pitch tunneling information. They're showing guys RPM information. Like Logan has talked a lot about how he wanted to change his pitch tunneling year to year. George Kirby is also kind of a pitching nerd, much the way that we are a little bit here. their hitting just hasn't quite. And I think when you even hear this in their approach and their control the zone approach, it's a little more. It They have a theory, but it's a little more hands off, right? Like it's a little more swing at the right pitches and hit them, kind of is like the whole philosophy. And you see this when you hear Jerry say things like we like their pitch selection is, and they hit the ball hard. Those are the two isms you get from the Mariners when they talk about their hitters. But those are, exit velocity is definitely something that hitters can control, but pitch selection is, we don't necessarily know how the Mariners quantify what they like. And even if we did, we don't know how that correlates to success as much as maybe they might think it does. I apologize if I was rambling there for a second about all of that. Mikey, clarify some of what I just said.
Dude, I do that for way longer than you do. I think, I mean, the nature of it is it's easier to just show a pitcher a grip or do something mechanically where they can, maybe add some, some like torso tilt and raise their arm slot, or um or just say, hey, dude, just like you're throwing your slider 25% of the time, just throw it 70. um it's much easier to do that than um to train hitters. And we see that across the league. We see that hitting development is lagging behind. And if you read books like MVP Machine, which I actually don't recommend because it's like Trevor Bauer propaganda, um, but you see in it that when they talk about tech, the hitting stuff is all like K vests and like different things that are interesting but aren't much. I think what we see more of is not not intra-player, but interplayer, meaning it's not so much teams making specific changes to players, and they are, but more so you see things like what the Giants are doing, where uh, they're matching um, hitters like swing planes and their swings to pitchers, and so in the playoffs, I think I said, hey, I think Cal Raleigh's going to have a good game against Alek Manoah, and I think he had a home run against him. I said that because Alek Manoah has really steep stuff and Cal Raleigh has a really steep swing. And so part of me wonders if it's just, more about kind of targeting certain stuff. I know that a more popular thing nowadays uh, is the counterweight knobs. They use them in golf, but I know that Paul Goldschmidt and Arenado use them and added bat speed. So I think it's about doing these more indirect things like adding bat speed and maybe tweaking bat path that like aren't, I guess, just aren't as direct. So you can't be sure that things are going to have positive effects. And I think it seems easier for a hitter's swing to get out of whack, and to be able to make adjustments like that on the fly mid-season are really tough, which you hear from players a lot. So, wow, I guess I followed up your rant with a different rant, but
It was good. It's a hard question, right? Like, and we both kind of said a similar thing, which is that it can vary player to player, because why something doesn't click for somebody is dependent on who they are. And it's one of those great statistics only matter in group settings. They don't matter to an individual context, right? Like Edgar Martinez was not a major league player, and then he did eye training exercises like with an optometrist. And if you haven't seen this before, it's wild, but they basically like they can retrain your depth perception using rope and like having you do basic eye exercises, and it turned him into the greatest hitter of all time. Would that work for everybody? Like, there isn't necessarily as clear a through line, I think, on a lot of the things that teams are doing to be progressive about making their hitters better. And I agree with what Mikey said too, that league wide, like, I don't know if any team is good at developing hitters. I know that some teams have specifically been unsuccessful with it historically. And the Mariners kind of fall into that bucket with some of the guys not working out, big names, Jeff Clement and like, Mike Zunino kind of taking off elsewhere. And
Jeff Clement.
Jeff Clement, how's that for some pulling up some
Wow.
names? Jeff Clement, Justin
That's
Ackley,
evil. That's evil.
Nick. Oh God, what was his last name?
Margavicius?
No,
Adam Moore.
shortstop. Adam Moore also. Adam Moore is supposed to be a great catcher.
Nick.
See,
Franklin?
Nick Franklin. Thank you. All these people we
No.
traded. Yeah. So that's how that goes. I don't think the Mariners are bad at developing hitters. I think that they have not shown a greater than average ability to do so relative to the rest of the league and relative to their ability to develop pitchers. That in
I
a
don't know.
nutshell.
We talked about it with Eno, as I made kind of a similar comment, but I think we've actually seen, a fair amount of development. I'm trying to think. Like Ty France developed with us, Cal Raleigh developed with us, Julio. Even top prospects don't always pan out, and he did. I guess we didn't necessarily with Jared Kelnick, but um, and I think it's also psychologically really, really tough for hitters to come up to just rake in the minor leagues and then come up to T-Mobile and hit a fucking scorcher in the gap, and it just kind of dies and hangs up there and doesn't get down. Um so I don't know. I guess we both can't really speak to it from a data perspective, but I think they've probably been at least average in terms of developing hitters. It's probably more so the what's the opposite of recency bias? It's you know the guys from before, the mid 2010s and before, that didn't develop, that are still really hanging around. But we've seen most guys come up and succeed, at least higher level hitters. So
Yeah, and a bunch of their
yeah.
kind of mid guys have been mid, and that's not an indication of failure. It's an indication of like them getting prospects to be who they were. Like I don't think Jake Fraley or Taylor Trammell are failures. They're just kind of like that's what they are. You know what I mean? Like Jared is definitely underwhelming, but Jared had higher expectations and a different pedigree, so it's different. But yeah, that's a long way for both of us to say if the Mariners knew, they wouldn't tell us, and they shouldn't, and they should just be awesome. But it is, and hitting is probably my personal belief. This is not anything else other than my personal belief. I think hitting a baseball with a stick is probably the hardest individual skill in professional sports. Like you can be good at soccer by being very athletic and being fast and having good lungs and like, good endurance and stuff. But like, that's the reason why we see guys like Edgar Martinez who are fundamentally unathletic, but who are like awesome at hitting a baseball because it's such a unique skill. I don't know if it can be taught to the same degree biomechanically as pitching. Um, but let's do two more questions and then we're going to wrap for today. Let's do the negative question first, then we'll end on kind of the more fun one. Brian Tesh says Dipoto gets canned at the end of the year if the team finishes below 85 wins. I say no. His relationship with the front
Mm.
office, with the just team ownership, seems to be way too positive. They did just extend him recently. 85 wins also doesn't represent a cataclysmic failure of the team. It represents them being 2 wins, 3 wins worse than their projections. So they got to bomb a lot harder than that. And they have to, somebody has to be bad that they paid. Like Luis Castillo has to fall apart, but not be injured. And Julio has to be injured for that, for that to even be on the table. Would you agree with that, Mikey?
Yeah, I think something awful would have to happen. And I think it'd be a hard sell to fans that the guy who, led them to their first playoff appearance, and actually, well, really, when's the last time they won a playoff series?
Yeah, they won a
Well,
playoff
I guess
series.
it's 2001 too. um, in 21 years, I think that's a tough sell. So I think unless they win like 68 games, even then, I think he's around.
Agreed. So Jerry's sticking around, but the last question today is from Cactus Mac. Assuming they get the same contract from the Mariners they got from other teams, which top free agents would you have signed? We would have obviously loved Aaron Judge and Carlos Correa. That contract definitely is out of the range of the Mariners. But in terms of guys who I think the team could have afforded and opted not to, Jose Abreu is the one that really kills me because, again, we've been talking about Will Myers being too rich for them. Jose Abreu would have been awesome for the hole we have on this team. I would have signed Mastaka Yoshida. I like him. Again, we need an outfielder. He got it 5 years, which, I don't love that length, but at the same time, we needed an upgrade. He looks like such an interesting, dynamic potential player. I would have given it to him. I also would have been happy with Conforto or Michael Brantley, given what they signed for. But Mikey, you had some different options.
Fuck, I could list off so many like. I mean, I think Aaron Judge. I don't know about Trey Turner anymore. Nemo, Correa, um, yeah, Conforto, and yeah, and the lower tier guys like um Brantley, Hanny. I think I would have done. I mean, there's so many names. I think the only guys that I'm a no on really are like Dansby, because I don't think it was a great fit, and guys that just play positions that the Mariners aren't after. So yeah, I think realistically, realistically, dude, I don't know. Like it's basically Hanny, I think, is the highest level option that the Mariners kind of might have done, but obviously they didn't, so wouldn't have, like um yeah, it's kind of a shit answer, but uh I think a lot of the middle tier options, the Mariners really need now and don't have.
Given that they signed no one, I don't think everyone is an unacceptable answer, right? Like
This is true.
there have been very few of these contracts, other than, like you said, maybe Turner, maybe Dansby, that I would take them on the Mariners. I wouldn't love them, as in I understand the risk involved, but like they would have all made the Mariners undeniably better. So I don't know if I have a good rebuttal to why they shouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Rizzo?
think he could DH. He could DH first base, like,
Yeah.
why not? Why not? It's gonna be
I like how
Cooper
you're
Hummel
like-
instead.
I like how you're like, yeah, everyone, and then I name someone. You're like, I don't.
I got to think about it for a second, but then I come back to Cooper Hummel, and I'm like, oh yeah, we should definitely stick some players in front of Cooper Hummel.
Book Cooper Hummel for 2 WAR.
Dude, he's gonna get at least 400 plate appearances for the Mariners this year.
120 WRC plus.
I would be stoked with that. Actually, that would be pretty cool.
It's gonna happen, or not.
All right, I think that's a lot of questions we answered for today. Happy holidays, everyone. Whatever you celebrate, wherever it is you are. Go Mariners. Happy holidays. I'm Evan. You can find me on Twitter at Evan James Audio. You can find Mikey, as always, at _Kuya Mikey. You can find the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get podcasts, wherever did you stream. Additionally, support the podcast on Patreon by going to patreon.com/neversunny in Seattle. Thank you for our new members. We don't have a name list up today, but we will put those in the credits for the video. Anyone who just signed up. Thank you guys for that. We put all of it towards buying new gear, new mics, new arms, anything we can use towards the production. So thank you. And just in general, after this has been kind of a strange year, a good year for the Mariners, certainly, but kind of a strange year across the board. We're just really pumped to have so many new people in the Discord chatting about the Mariners, hitting us up with questions. This is fun for us. So thank you guys for being here. Happy New Year's, happy holidays. We'll see you in 2023.